We might get underway. Can I welcome you to the first lecture in 2015 in the Commission's Workplace Relations Education series. Over the last 12 months, the series has featured mock hearings and lectures delivered in collaboration with universities around Australia and other organisations. We also have an invited paper series which encourages the publication of research papers in the broad field of workplace relations. Today's lecture is being held in collaboration with the Industrial Relations Society of Tasmania and will be delivered by Amanda Pyman. Amanda is an Associate Professor in the Department of Management at, it says here, Monash University. Was that previously, or you hold both appointments? And was previously the Director of the Monash MBA program from 2012 to 2014. Prior to joining Monash at the end of 2010, Amanda was the Deputy MBA Director at the Kent Business School in the University of Kent in the UK. And she is also an Associate Fellow and Teaching Associate in the Warwick Business School at the University of Warwick in the UK. Amanda's broad area of research interest is people and performance, and she is currently researching Australian worker representatives and participation and employee voice, and comparative trade union strategies in the retail sector in the UK, Australia and New Zealand, as well as the digitalisation of the employment relationship. Today, Amanda will speak about the role of consultation in the future of Australian workplaces within the context of an increasingly globalised environment. I'd like to welcome Amanda to the podium.
Okay, well, for some of you, you may think I've gone to the dark side running an MBA program for the last couple of years, but I do have some credentials in industrial relations. My PhD was in IR and I've taught undergraduate industrial relations. So you'd be hard pushed to get an industrial relations subject in an MBA. It's typically called managing people or some variant of organisational behaviour in HRM, but it still allows academics the flexibility to bring in the concepts of industrial relations and workplace relations, which are critical. I should start by thanking Justice Ross, Lauren, Kate and the team at the Commission for inviting me here today. It's a pleasure to be here and I hope to say something that's of interest to you all. This is related to a paper that I'm writing for the Commission and I understand that will be available fairly soon. I've been told to talk for about perhaps 40 minutes and then I'll leave some time for questions at the end, so happy to take any questions that you might have. I've gone for plain white, so no graphics and boring slides, but hopefully the substance will be interesting. So a little bit about what I'm going to talk about, and sorry for standing here, but I have been told that it's being filmed and I have to speak into the microphone, so I will try not to move around too much. So a little bit of context, look at defining consultation, what are the different forms of consultation, what's the rationale, the extent of consultation in Australian workplaces, very timely given the release of the AWERS from the Fair Work Commission. Interestingly, I am part of a research team that will have access to some of that data, which is very exciting, and we will be able to analyse that in greater depth. Talk a little bit about the effective integration of consultation and then offer some thoughts on the future of consultation in Australian workplaces. So by way of setting a little bit of context, and this won't be a surprise to many of you in the room, but we do know that we are operating our workplaces operating in an increasingly globalised environment. And this is timely given the Productivity Commission inquiry into the workplace relations framework, of which productivity is obviously a key concern in that inquiry, and looking at how the workplace relations framework has been performing. We've seen dramatic change in the workplace relations landscape more broadly. So a particular interest or focus of some of the research that I'm doing and many other colleagues both in Australia and internationally is around the idea of employee representation, participation and involvement. And of course, if you take the HR paradigm, and perhaps members of the audience are HR practitioners, there is also an ever-increasing interest in the concept of employee engagement, which has been linked to high-performing workplaces or high-performing work systems, whichever terminology you prefer. But this context has come about largely, particularly the interest in employee voice, as we describe it, has come about largely because of the decline in trade union representation. So in Australia, the proportion of the workforce now unionised sits around 18-19%. So that's a dramatic decline over the last 40 plus years. But alongside that, we've seen dramatic labour market deregulation, we've seen increased technological sophistication, increased education levels in terms of the workforce more broadly, the growing army of what we call knowledge workers perhaps is of interest to some of you, industry restructuring, and the widespread use of neoliberal ideologies in the policy and economic environments. And so all of those changes have combined and in some ways been an antecedent, I guess, or a determinant of a decline in union representation and what we would call union voice. And alongside that, we've seen rapid diffusion of what we would call direct and or non-union voice, and I'll distinguish those terms a little bit later. I have tried to perhaps buffer this with a little bit of academic rigour, but also some more practical insights as well. So hopefully that will suffice. But really, when I'm talking about employee voice, at its most basic level, it's about employees having a say in matters that affect them at the workplace, having a say in organisational decision making. So if you strip it back to that kind of concept, it's simple, but it matters in terms of the productivity and the prosperity of our workplaces, both now and into the future. Okay, so this is the particular lens that I'm going to adopt. So perhaps you'd prefer information provision, you'd prefer consultation, you'd prefer participation. I'm going to wrap those terms together and use an overarching lens of what I would term employee voice. So we're referring to all of those things, and clearly they sit on a continuum, on a spectrum where they represent different aspects of how information is provided and how employees do or do not have a say in decision making at work. So a working definition that will guide my comments today for the next 30 minutes or so is that we're talking about how employees are able to have a say over work activities and decisions within the organisations in which they work, regardless of the institutional channels or the mechanisms or processes through which that voice operates. And we'll look at a range of different mechanisms that are common in workplaces today. So I quite like this typology. There's four, we can break down what employee voice means in four different ways. So here in the next two slides, I've given you a little typology to think about how we might think about employee voice and its different manifestations in Australian workplaces. So what's the meaning of voice? What's its purpose and articulation? The mechanisms and practices that you would see in workplaces, and the range of outcomes that are likely to result. So if we take the first one, the articulation of individual dissatisfaction. At its most basic purpose, it's about rectifying a problem with management or addressing a deterioration in the relationship between employer and employees. So how would that play out in the organisation? What's the mechanism or practice? There are a range of options, but most commonly a complaint to the line manager or through a grievance procedure. And the outcomes are then again situated on a continuum of what we would call exiting the employment relationship, or expressing a voice, with the purpose of being loyal to the employer and remaining employed within that particular workplace. Despite the fact that union or collective voice has declined in Australia, and that's certainly a trend that's common to most Anglo-American countries, is that there is one particular variant which is about an expression of collective organisation. And this goes back to the fundamental roots of trade unions about providing a countervailing power to management, to employers' power in the employment relationship, which we know is inherently unequal. So the potential practices or mechanisms here, particularly in the UK, for example, where I lived and worked for 6 years, around union recognition, and the opposite of that is de-recognising unions, collective bargaining agreements and enterprise bargaining, and of course industrial action. That's the lever that trade unions have and the threat that they can pose to employers in terms of taking legal industrial action. And you may be familiar with the concept of partnership in the UK, which is about establishing a consultative relationship with trade unions, and that was really the mandate of Tony Blair, and that's continued on still to this day in different forms. So first one, articulation of individual dissatisfaction. Second, expression of collective organisation. The third, which is the dominant HRM paradigm, is the idea that voice is a means to contribute to management decision making. So here the purpose is around seeking improvements in work organisation, quality and productivity, and there's a whole range of practices or mechanisms that workplaces can use to actually facilitate that kind of voice, whether it's upward problem solving, quality circles, suggestion schemes, particular types of involvement and participation schemes. Interestingly, we've seen a decline in formal quality circles, employee involvement schemes over the last 2 decades in particular. And here the range of outcomes, this is depending on the way in which you want to read into the HRM mantra and the idea of high performance work systems. The positive spin on that kind of philosophy is that by allowing employees to contribute to decision making, that you can enhance their commitment, their loyalty, their identity to the corporate culture and the organisation, to reduce disillusionment, apathy, etc. And the whole notion is that if you do that, that enables improved productivity and performance. So a fairly simplistic idea, and certainly one that's not a linear relationship. So this is the problem when we try and research these things empirically. It's very hard to disentangle the actual contribution of voice practices to improve productivity and performance, because it's tied up in so many factors in the workplace. And the fourth idea of voice is a demonstration of mutuality and cooperative relations, not in some ways dissimilar to the third, but this has a much more long-term view rather than just short-term contributing to decisions as they arise. The idea that it's about establishing a climate of workplace relations that's positive, that's long-term, where the cooperative relationships are embedded in the organisation. And so this tends to happen through more representative forms of voice, so that employees have elected representatives to actually express voice in the workplace, whether that's through partnership agreements, joint consultation, or works councils, which are certainly common in Europe, but have not really, in the institutional environment here in Australia, had much traction. Again, it's based on the idea that there's an influence over management decisions, and I guess the difference here between 3 and 4 is the idea that if you are establishing cooperative relationships, it's a more genuine opportunity for employees to influence the outcome of decision making, not just having input. And that's a key difference that you need to consider in practice, is to what extent do these practices or mechanisms that you're using to either inform, consult or enable participation, to what extent do they genuinely allow for power sharing between the actors, between the parties in the employment relationship. So I like that as a typology, because I think it's easy to think about voice very narrowly, and I think this opens up our thinking in terms of the different meanings and purposes and the way in which those play out in practice in Australian workplaces. Another typology, sort of building on that, if you like, is the idea that you have direct, unmediated forms of voice, so simply employer and employee. Indirect, which is the idea of non-union voice, so employees have a say through representatives, but they're not union representatives. Representative voice is the idea that it is through union representatives, so elected union representatives. And of course, there's the idea of financial participation, that employees have a financial stake in the workplace and that performance and productivity of the workplace is tied to particular forms of employee share ownership or similar such schemes. But I return to this key point, the idea of sharing of authority and power. And certainly one of the things you see if you look at differences across the Anglo-American countries, or what we would call liberal market economies, compared to most of Western Europe, coordinated market economies, is a big difference in the degree to which voice mechanisms actually enable the sharing of power and authority. So in liberal market economies like Australia, like New Zealand, like the UK, like the US, managers and employers have a particularly short-term orientation, and that does not really facilitate or enable, in many cases in practice, an investment in these types of practices. Coordinated market economies have a much greater interest and long-term orientation, and typically invest in tripartite or cooperative relations between both government employers and employees. So we do see a difference, we see cross-national differences in this space which are important. And of course that goes back to, in some ways, to the regulation and the legislative environment and the way in which that impacts on these types of ideas. So what are so having said that, outline the different types or forms of employee voice, what really are the benefits of having employee voice in the workplace? You could probably sum them up in 3 different ways. The first is around communication, enabling more direct or mediated, in the case of trade unions, communication, with the idea that if you do that, if you enhance communication through these various practices and channels, that has a positive influence on the levels of trust of employees, their cooperation, their engagement, their motivation, their satisfaction, etc., etc. And in turn, that benefits productivity and performance for the workplace. And there's certainly evidence that would suggest that the benefits around communication do help. It can also, even in the case where you don't have representative trade unions in the workplace, remove, in some ways make it more efficient to deal with conflict and actually uncover issues that managers or employees were not aware of previously. So it has a benefit in terms of both the location at which conflict takes place, but also the type of conflict and airing perhaps grievances that employers weren't aware of. And the third, I would say, the third benefit is around where it works in practice, is around the idea of joint problem solving. That employees actually take an interest in the issues in the workplace and start to collaborate to jointly problem solve with employers. And if you look at much of the evidence around joint problem solving, then it will tell you that that's largely successful, because particularly in manufacturing or service organisations, employees on the front line have an intimate knowledge of the tasks and the work that they're doing and can genuinely offer improvements to the practices and processes within the organisation. So a range of potential benefits, but again, contingent on the idea that it works effectively and it's successful, and I'll come back to that shortly. I can't come and do an invited lecture for the Fair Work Commission without mentioning some of the legalities, I am not a labour lawyer, but I'm clearly familiar with the labour law, but I'm not a labour lawyer, and hence I'm not taking that particular lens today. But we do know that, importantly, through the Fair Work Act, there is a default clause for enterprise agreements around consultation. And this is largely the obligations upon the employer when there is likely to be a change in the workplace and that is deemed to have an effect or an impact on the employees. And so if in a bargaining situation, employers and employees, either through themselves or their representative, don't agree to a particular clause on consultation, then this is the default clause that will be inserted into enterprise agreements. Again, because I'm putting this up here, just to point out that it is a default clause, and this is a huge difference to the previous iterations of the Workplace Relations Act, for example, which didn't have a default consultation clause. Again, I return to the idea of the importance of the legal framework. And the legal framework should do just that. It should provide a framework and a safety net, and this does that for enterprise agreements. But more importantly, the degree of legal support for consultation is a key issue and a key difference that we see across countries. So if you're familiar with the European Union and the case of the United Kingdom, in the UK they introduced the Information and Consultation of Employees Regulations, clearly easier to refer to them as the ICE regulations. So these regulations mandate that any business with 50 or more employees are legally required to inform and consult their employees on a whole range of changes that take place in the workplace, including the financial stability of the enterprise or the workplace. So the degree of the legal support for consultation or employee voice, however you prefer to call it, is a key factor in shaping what happens in practice in workplaces. And it shapes that through various means. For example, the degree of legal support can have an impact on the responsibilities of, say, joint consultative committees as a mechanism of employee voice. How? Because it determines, in some ways, their power, for example, over the range of issues or the subject matter that joint consultation body is enabled to discuss in the workplace. So are they clearly operational issues or are they strategic, high-level issues? So remember that the institutions and regulation are important, and the degree of legal support here is a key differentiating factor when you're looking at evidence across countries. Okay, so in theory, it all sounds great. And certainly if you read HRM textbooks, you will receive or you'll be party to that dominant kind of unitarist perspective that this can only be a good thing. But why? Why do we want to actually do it? Apart from the assumed benefits, how can we actually categorise or think about what is the rationale for employee voice? The first one is clearly an agenda around performance. Again, timely given the current inquiry into the workplace relations framework, which talks at length about productivity and performance and the way in which the workplace relations framework impacts on the productivity of enterprises. So the performance rationale is largely around engendering loyalty, and on that basis, enhancing productivity and performance. Another paradigm or rationale for employee voice is around the idea of citizenship. That for an employee to participate in decisions that affect them at work, that is a basic right of citizens in a democracy. This was very much a trendy or popular mantra through the 1980s, if you're familiar with the ideas of industrial democracy. So it's much more, it's largely seen as rights-based, that it's a democratic right for employees to participate. We've shifted far away from that now in contemporary workplaces, where it's not seen to be rights-based. Transaction cost economics, if you're an economist, the idea is all around efficiency, transaction efficiency. So the idea that the employer can switch between different mechanisms of voice depending on what's most effective, whether that's union voice or non-union voice. So if you have a large unionised workforce, that perhaps the most efficient way to consult and enable voice is through union committees, because a large proportion of the workforce is unionised. Power and control, the idea that enabling employees to have a voice is a means to share power in the employment relationship. And again, particularly in the case of trade unions, to act as a countervailing power to the power of employers and the mobility of capital. And perhaps job design as a separate one, but certainly part of the first as well in terms of performance, that you design jobs to enable employees to have a say for the purpose of engagement and commitment. Again, very much a unitarist idea that the employer and the employee have shared goals, and that it's in the best interests of employees to identify with the corporate culture and to pursue those shared goals. So I want to make, at this point, the lecture slightly interactive. I don't know if previous lectures have done that, but I'm going to do it. So I just want you to talk to the person next to you just for 2 minutes. Can employee voice improve organisational effectiveness and employee well-being and allow workers to have a genuine say in organisations? Just want you to discuss that for 2 minutes. Okay. Who's going to be brave enough to shout out a couple of thoughts? Yes?
We're just talking about that under the IR legislative framework, it bounced backwards and forward depending upon the philosophy of the government of the day.
Mm-hmm.
But over the last 35 years, it's been quite consistent in work health and safety. It's maintained a tripartite consultative approach.
Mm-hmm.
And also, to a lesser extent, in harassment and discrimination legislation,
Mm-hmm.
there's some built-in consultative approaches. And so I have these discussions with organisations who talk about having a unitarist approach in industrial relations and saying, well, isn't that inconsistent? You're giving one message to the employees when we talk IR, and there's a completely different message when we talk work health and safety and equality and diversity issues. Aren't you confusing people?
Excellent. You're absolutely right. I mean, occupational health and safety stands out as the outlier in this case, and has had robust legislative framework since the 1980s. So it is interesting that there's a dichotomy between the two. Other thoughts?
What we said was definitely an employee voice can improve organisational effectiveness and productivity, but we have to be really careful, I think, about the structures that are there, because nothing destroys a relationship more than people feeling like they will have a say and then there not being an effective follow-up of those matters, and not feeling like their issues have been taken on board, or an explanation as to why certain things couldn't happen.
Yes, very good. And you're absolutely right. Two kind of key points from that. The first is around trust and the importance of trust in the employment relationship. But even if it's not a means of employees having an ability to change the outcome, the sheer process of enabling them to contribute to the decision or input into the decision, even if they don't have veto over the final outcome, is very important. And so in the academic literature, we talk about the importance of justice, so distributive and procedural justice, and that often employees, if they understand the process and have been involved in that process, then they're more likely to accept the outcome regardless of whether that's positive or negative. So excellent points. Anything up the back?
I guess just following on from that point, I guess it's important to, although the employee should have their voice, it's important for the employer to manage their expectations regarding what can actually be done. Although employees may have these issues, it does depend on whether a solution can actually be found. And I guess that's important in the voicing process, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. So around employee expectations and carefully managing expectations is critical. And that's part of the trusting cooperative relationship that employers perhaps won't always be able to deal with a situation as employees would like. But the fact that there's a due process, that there's been a discussion, that they understand how employers have arrived at the outcome, I think that is really important in terms of the mechanisms that you have in place. Okay, so all very good points. You've passed the test, and I'll return to some of those ideas at the end when I talk about perhaps the requirements for success. If you look at the recent findings from the AWERS, from the Fair Work Commission, the Australian Workplace Relations Survey, the first findings report is available. And if you look at that report, there's a whole section on employee engagement, which is essentially around practices for employee voice. And in practice, if you look at those findings, you can see that the rationale for employees having a say in decisions at their workplace is also related to these factors listed here. So the time that people feel they have to complete their task, employees' perceptions of the time, which links to the degree of flexibility and freedom and autonomy in their roles, stress or lack thereof in the workplace, satisfaction, so global satisfaction, overall, are you satisfied with your job? But also discrete elements of satisfaction, so whether that's satisfaction around pay, around how they organise their work, their hours, etc., etc. The degree of job security, so that the more input and voice that employees have, the more secure they feel in the employment relationship. Their intentions to stay or leave in a workplace, flexibility practices, and freedom and autonomy, which I have mentioned. So this idea of employee voice in theory sounds great, but has very significant practical implications in the workplace that are of interest not only to employees, but for employers. Employers need to know, for example, what's their talent pipeline? What does their retention look like? What does turnover look like? These things relate to that.
Just quickly on that job security, given there's quite a lot of organisations that are restructuring and downsizing, there's a countervailing view that the more you speak up, the higher you go on the list to be targeted. Sure.
And I think, again, it depends on the culture of the workplace and the degree to which the robust sharing of ideas and knowledge is seen to be valued in an organisation. But no, I agree with you, that's certainly the sinister side of speaking up. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the evidence in practice, what's actually going on in Australian workplaces. This is taken from the first findings report from the Commission. And again, as I said, there's a whole section on employee engagement. They looked at what are the methods of communication that workplaces use to communicate to employees or receive communication from employees. So there's just a breakdown of some of the statistics. So the use of representatives or union delegates hovering around 30%, perhaps not surprising. Communicating to all of the workforce, so whether that's through memos, videos now in higher education institutions are very common. So we have a video from the Vice-Chancellor updating all employees on what's happening. I'm sure it's the same at UTAS as it is at Monash. Methods of communication to teams and departments, very high, and also not surprisingly, given the shift to a focus on the individual nature of the employment relationship rather than a collective dimension, very high levels of individual communication or one-to-one communication. The first findings report from the Commission also looks at the extent of flexible working practices based on employee and employer experiences, and I haven't summarised the results here because there's pages of results that you can have a look at, but they look at the availability of flexibility arrangements across the workforce, the different types of arrangements that are in use, and this is actually included under the section of employee engagement. So hence the earlier slide linking the idea of having a voice to flexibility arrangements in practice. And there's various types of flexible arrangements that the report looks at. Just as a contrast, and so there is a slight difference here. This is the AWERPS, not the AWERS. This is a national survey that myself and a team of researchers have been involved in. It's been conducted over 3 time periods. National survey of employees, so once in 2004, again in 2007, and again in 2010. So a little bit dated now, but indicative also of the extent of employee voice and the different types of arrangements that are in play in Australian workplaces. And again, I don't think you'd see many surprises there. Third one down, EIP, employee involvement practices or policies. Formal employee involvement policies, like quality circles, have declined dramatically in Australian workplaces. Much more common to use the idea of open door policy, newsletters, direct forms of communication with employees. But I also think the latter points are interesting. So we asked employees in their workplaces, what types of access to voice do you have? And we distinguished between what we called non-union voice, union voice, and hybrid voice, so the combination of the two. And non-union voice, only non-union voice was 44%, union-only voice 4%, and hybrid forms of voice 48%. So the most common arrangement that employees have access to is a combination of union and non-union voice. Now, non-union voice means that it's not through a trade union, obviously, but can be through representatives, and typically is through elected representatives. So they're not members of a union, but they are representatives elected by the workforce. And we also asked about, interestingly, union reach. And I think this is important because we're constantly talking about the idea that trade union voice has declined. And so what we asked here is, to what extent is there a union at your workplace that you can join? So the idea of union reach. What reach do trade unions have? And actually almost half of the sample said that they had access to a union that they could join. So this reinforces the data that's telling us that there is a significant decline in the extent to which employees are choosing to exercise voice through trade unions. This doesn't cover everything. There's clearly a whole range of other predictors of employee voice in organisations: size, ownership, the age of the organisation, whole range of predictors, and I don't go into that level of detail here. The one thing that I do want to point out as being important, and it came up in some of the comments, is the idea of the industrial relations climate, or the workplace relations climate, if you prefer that language. The general state of relations between employers and employees. And consistently in our surveys, in our 3 surveys, we found that the industrial relations climate was perceived by employees to be more favourable when they perceived that management were not opposed to trade unions. That led to a more favourable industrial relations climate. So what do we take away from that? The importance of cooperative relationships between employers and employees, and having, where you have employees that are unionised, proactive dialogue with the trade union. So it's no good for employers just to simply say, we don't wish to engage. but having a productive relationship. We find that that colours employees' perceptions of what they feel about the state of the industrial relations climate in their organisation. And so I think that's an interesting finding. The other interesting thing that we asked is to what extent is the industrial relations climate favourable? Now, bearing in mind this was conducted in 2010, so the beginning of the Fair Work Act, and perhaps not enough time to really judge the impact of that piece of legislation. But in 2010, 82% of employees told us that the climate was favourable. And that's interesting to me. Because if you look at the Productivity Commission's inquiry, and maybe you're all writing submissions to send to them, they clearly, in some ways, and I shouldn't be so partisan perhaps, but I think they assume that the legislation is the problem. Now, there may well be problems with the legislation, but the legislation is a very important framework in setting up that climate and achieving a balance between fairness and equity and efficiency. And so I think the fact that employees feel and perceive a favourable industrial relations climate is interesting compared to some of perhaps the media commentary that we hear about workplaces and Australian employees. So we're a happy bunch, essentially. Things could be better. I'm not suggesting that they couldn't, but that largely employees perceive a fairly favourable industrial relations climate. Businesses, of course, have a huge problem with the idea of red tape and the bureaucracy surrounding the regulatory environment. So, to summarise these in a couple of slides, and then I'll allow you to ask any questions that you might have. Effective integration. How do we effectively integrate employee voice in our workplaces? I think there's three main strands to this. The first is the actors themselves, employers and employees, the idea that there's a cooperative, productive relationship that's built on mutual trust. One practice alone is unlikely to have a positive impact on performance. It's about bundling appropriate practices within the context and the culture of the organisation. The idea of bundling, that the sum is greater than its parts. So in introducing one individual employee voice practice is unlikely to have a quantum leap in terms of your productivity or your performance, but integrating a whole series of practices that are mutually consistent and align with one another is much more likely to have a favourable impact. And this is the idea of what we call in the academic terminology embeddedness, that practices are embedded in the very fabric and the culture of the organisation. Because if it's simply a bolt-on, it won't work. It's got to be infused into the culture of the organisation itself. And going back to some of my earlier comments, clearly the external environment, what's happening in the external environment, whether that's competition in your product markets, your labour markets, the legislative environment, the political environment, the general state of the economic environment, social preferences, norms, values, all of those things matter too. So it's hard. You've got to strike a balance between these different aspects. So, what future for consultation? I think the earlier point about occupational health and safety is an excellent one, and one that continues to baffle us as academics, that we can have a watershed moment with the termination, change and redundancy case in the 1980s. And occupational health and safety in this country is one of the most well-regulated across the world. And it's certainly clearly a very important issue. But the same rules of the game don't apply when we think about employee voice. But arguably, the evidence does tell us that most employees do wish to have a say and want to contribute to the work issues and decisions that affect them. Work is a key part of what they do, and they want to be able to shape that. What role for a diversity agenda? many areas of the workforce that are marginalised or don't have a voice? To what extent do we need a stronger safety net for those people, or to reflect the diversity of voices and the diversity of people that make up our workforce? Social media and modern information and communication technologies, lots of, if you read the practitioner press, particularly in the HR space, lots of cases around sackings due to comments on Facebook or Twitter or whatever it might be. But clearly, social media can actually play a role in engaging and communicating with employees. And some of the the big consultancy organisations use, for example, Yammer, which works really well as an internal communication mechanism. So I think we need to think about, consistent with the changing times, the role of social media in a communication strategy. From my point of view, the evidence and the research that I look at, I do think that employee voice, having a say at work, is a driver of engagement, and that it is part of a necessary process to have productive and favourable outcomes in the workplace. Of course, the challenge that remains, and it's a perennial one, is actually evaluating the effectiveness of voice. And as I said earlier, it's incredibly hard to do that because it's incredibly tough to disentangle the role of, for example, a joint consultative committee in improving productivity and performance relative to everything else at play in the workplace. So we need to get better as academics, and I'm talking from my particular viewpoint here for the academics in the room, in terms of our research design and the way in which we do research, to do longitudinal research and get better at evaluating the success and measuring the effectiveness of voice. I would finish with 2 points. A need for power sharing that can affect change and enable a genuine say. Again, so this doesn't suggest that employees actually have a veto over the final outcome, but that the say is genuine. And that goes back to some of the comments made earlier. There is going to be a need to distribute some of that power, the calculus that exists in the employment relationship, to actually have a positive impact on outcomes. And I think there's an ongoing need, as you can see. So I started with some of the context. We've seen employee voice and the range of practices and the mechanisms change, consistent with broader changes in the workplace relations landscape. And so I think there's a constant need to reevaluate voice in relation to time and space to appropriately capture its meaning and its purpose as our working environments continue to change. It must be relevant and it must have substance. That's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Amanda. It's a very timely presentation, especially from the tribunal's point of view. We're looking at how we can move forward with our new approaches in relation to industrial relations, that is, taking a more proactive approach to encourage parties to talk to one another outside the direct bargaining for an agreement. Too often parties come together when their agreement's coming up to expiry. They have an intense period of interaction and then they don't see each other for 4 years. And we are exploring ways to provide a shift in that dynamic, to have regular engagement, and also to move away from adversarial bargaining to more interest-based bargaining. And this fits neatly in that space. So thank you very much. A small token of our appreciation from our archives, and we hope you enjoy it, and thank you very much for taking the time to present to us today. Thanks, Amanda.
Justin.
Thank you.